Well, since the COVID-19 pandemic began, there have been endless challenges within the schooling system, and many of these difficulties have been carried into 2021, which is where we find ourselves. Not only did the second wave of the virus delay the reopening of schools, but more than 16,000 learners between grade 1 and 8 remain at home, and as yet they have not been placed in a school. The Basic Education Department says there's an overwhelming demand for spaces at schools that are already completely full. It has further pleaded with guardians and parents to cooperate with district officials. Well, joining us now from the Equal Education Law Centre is the Executive Director, Tshego Phala. Tshego, thank you. Thanks for being with us.
Morning, Leanne. Thanks for having me, and morning to your viewers.
So the department says that parents want their children to attend a specific school and are not cooperating when second choices are presented to them. What sense are you getting from both parents and the department?
Thanks, Leanne. I think the reality is we need to realize that the reason there's such high numbers of unplaced learners is, firstly, there is this issue of parents having first choice of schools and parents having not been accepted in a school of choice. But really, the reality of the 16,000 learners which you see are learners who, in fact, have not been placed at all. So those learners currently do not have a school. And so there's various issues with admissions, not just a school of choice issue. There's also an issue of schools being oversubscribed and honestly not having space to put in any learners, parents having applied late and arriving at a school on the 15th hoping to get a place, but also those parents who in fact did apply for a school but have not been accepted in any school at all. So there's varying sorts of levels of issues in the spectrum of admissions.
A lot of people feel like this is almost like an underrepresentation of the amount of students or learners that are looking for schools. Do you agree with that? Because it seems that this number's a bit lower than in reality how many kids are still looking for schools.
Definitely. I mean, the numbers we got in the minister's briefing on Sunday, which in fact is over 16,000. It's 24, at the time it was 24,000, which was cumulative of unplaced grade 1 learners and unplaced grade 8 learners. That's not a representation of learners who are looking for places in other grades. And definitely at the Equal Education Law Centre, we are seeing those sort of learners who now need a school because they've had to move provinces. We've seen COVID actually leading to a lot of migration and a lot of movement. So there's those type of learners. And also remember that the numbers that we're being given are those learners who are currently on the list of unplaced learners. There may be some parents who didn't apply properly. And so honestly, the numbers are probably much more than what we're actually seeing.
That's the sense that I'm getting from the amount of parents that are complaining at this time. I mean, if we look back to 2020, because this is not a new problem, it's something that we've been complaining about and parents have been complaining about for a while. Those unresolved cases, what happened to them? Did those learners get put into schools, or did you find that some of those learners were never ever placed and they were just ignored in the system?
Leanne, we run a daily walk-in clinic, an education law walk-in clinic, and every year around this time, we know that daily we're going to be receiving 20, 30 calls a day from parents of unplaced learners. Sadly, when we look at some of the cases we've got some learners who sit for months on end not being able to be placed in schools. So the issue is actually quite big. It's quite a big issue. It's an issue which happens year in and year out. We are, however, hopeful because recently the Department of Basic Education published for public comment a draft policy on admissions. And we're hoping to make comments on that, comments which speak to the systemic issues. Because quite honestly, we can't be sitting every year when the schools reopen with the same admissions issue. It's not a new issue. It's a recurring issue. And COVID has obviously just impacted even and compounded that issue.
Yeah, and this I know that the department speaks to and says that it is COVID, but from what we're hearing, we cannot just blame this on COVID. This is a system that has been flawed somewhat, not entirely, but somewhat to a certain extent. So let's go back to where the problems are coming in. What is the problem? some people obviously saying that, the parents want their kids at a specific school and they won't accept the second choice. And the department saying that that is the problem. The parents must accept the second choice. But there's a tussle and no meeting place therein. But where lies the actual problem?
I think I would say there's three main problems that I see. The first problem is infrastructure, and the fact that we have lack of infrastructure in our basic education department. We have many schools being oversubscribed, overcrowded, and we saw last year with COVID the budget for infrastructure being decreased, and so we're going to see that problem being even more personified during this time. The second issue, I think, is a lack of proper communication between schools and the districts. So you have this tussle, which seems to happen between schools and the department districts about how many learners should go to the schools, who has the final say, and that sort of impacts things. You also do have parents wanting specific schools in specific areas, and those areas become oversubscribed. But I think we shouldn't just see that issue as a simple issue. That issue is an issue which is informed by our legacy of apartheid, informed by the legacy of Model C schools, and those schools which are doing better than other schools because they are better resourced or better supported. And so parents do then apply for those schools. But the need of parents for a school of choice, as it's often called, is far more complicated than just a want. It's informed by certain issues which inform our education system, sadly, in South Africa.
So, I imagine that the issues are not the same in all of the provinces. I mean, in Gauteng, for example, it's mostly online admissions and access for some parents. How would you categorize these kind of challenges?
Yeah, so in Gauteng and where electronic systems are being used, some parents have complained about the system not being user-friendly, not being pro-poor, so not easy to navigate. In some instances, as I said, it is parents, and it's parents who haven't applied on time and who come in the morning with the child in a school uniform for a school they didn't formally apply for. And in other instances, it is this issue where parents are advised to apply for more than one school, but only apply for one. So really, I think it's all the role players and the need for everybody to come to the party and realize what challenges we face, and that we all need to kind of do what we need to do to get learners to access their right to basic education.
And that's, it is a huge challenge. I mean, we were reading an article by news agency Groundup, which does a lot of research on education issues. Basically, what they say is there's also an influx of learners from neighboring countries and also school closures in some rural areas due to a lack of resources. What have you managed to establish with these allegations that have been made?
I mean, there are some learners from neighboring countries, but our constitutional court has been very clear that those learners should not be discriminated against, and that whether or not those learners have documentation or no documentation, our courts have said that access to the right to education in South Africa is for any child who's within our borders. And so that's our stance on undocumented learners or learners from neighboring countries, that they should be accommodated. So that's our stance, and of course, so that's my stance. Sorry, Leah. Yes, okay. I was thinking about it further, but actually, that is our stance.
That is the stance. Full stop. Nothing more to add. I mean, but I want to start sort of concluding and trying to sort of get to where we go from here, because I mean, if we look at the stats, it's 16,000, but we've gathered that it is probably a lot more than that haven't been placed. I mean, we're almost 2 months now into the year. School started at the beginning of this week. How likely is it that they're going to be placed?
I think it's a bit early to tell, Leanne, and I think we should give the department a few weeks. We've seen some positive movement in Gauteng of learners being placed. We've seen Western Cape pushing a bit. But if our experience from past years is anything to go by, we know that even around March, April, May, we may still have learners who are saying, my child is still not placed. But I think it's something that we need to keep our eye on. I think it's something that we need to push on, because quite honestly, the reality is, for so long as a learner is not placed, that's a learner sitting at home and not accessing their right to basic education, which should be a right which is immediately realizable in South Africa.
Yeah, and also, I mean, it is going to be quite telling when we see the matric results coming through, and also getting an understanding of how they performed this year and how many kids actually have dropped out of the schooling system, because we know that COVID, that's been a big thing, is that kids have literally just disappeared. They never came back to school and they're not being educated. Now we've got kids that are not being placed into schools, and this is having a major effect on education here in South Africa. Is that a concern to you as well, those that have dropped out and disappeared out of the system?
Definitely. There was a lot of time lost last year, children who've been lost to the system. But one of our concerns is that in terms of the directions which the department published last year, parents were allowed to, if a child had a comorbidity or if the parent was anxious about the pandemic, parents were allowed to keep their children at home, but they had to make an application to let the department know. Last year, we were quite concerned that the need to actually let the department know was not adequately communicated to parents. So we do get the sense that the dropout numbers won't be very clear to us, because we won't know why the learners left. But we do feel it is something that the department speaks often about. I'm hoping that it's something that they will prioritize, because there is a need to troubleshoot. Is it that this is parents who didn't return because of anxieties, or are these actually learners who we've lost to the system? And if we have, it's something we need to pay particular attention to this year, especially because the learners who are still in the system have lost learning time, even though they remain in the system.
We leave it there, Tshego. Thank you. Thanks so much for talking to us. Tshego Phala is from the Equal Education Law Centre, talking to us about the thousands of learners across the country who aren't attending school, as they haven't been placed as yet. And we're already almost finished with the first week of school, and they still are not at school, which is it's a big problem. All right, let's quickly just get into our question of the day.